The boardroom had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Zurich financial district, each pane worth more than most people's annual salaries. I'd chosen every detail of this room 32 years ago. The hand-laid Belgian marble with subtle gold threading, the custom conference table carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, even the specific angle of the morning light that would cast the CEO in the most commanding position. Now, as I sat in the farthest chair from that position, I watched my own design work against me. "Item 7, my nephew Julian announced, barely glancing in my direction. His Patek Philippe, a gift I'd helped him select for his 30th birthday, caught the light as he gestured dismissively at the documents before him. Restructuring of the advisory board. I'd spent 3 decades turning my brother's modest textile import business into Kensington and Vale, a luxury conglomerate worth $4.3 billion. I'd negotiated the merger that quadrupled our valuation. I'd identified and acquired 17 brands that now comprised our portfolio's crown jewels. I'd restructured our supply chains across 4 continents, personally cultivating relationships with manufacturers from Como to Kyoto. And I'd done it all without title, without public recognition, because my brother, Julian's father, my late brother Harrison, had asked me to stay in the shadows. "The face of the company needs consistency," he'd said, "but I need your mind behind everything." I'd believed him. God help me, I'd believed every word. "As of the end of this quarter," Julian continued, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd never actually built anything, "we'll be streamlining advisory positions to reflect current strategic priorities. Those whose contributions have become redundant will be transitioned out with appropriate severance packages." Appropriate severance. I almost laughed. The legal documents sitting in my apartment, documents I'd discovered only last week while searching for an old contract, told a different story, a complete story. The story of how my name had been systematically removed from every founding document, every partnership agreement, every equity distribution over the past 8 years, since Harrison's death. The empire I'd helped build had never been meant for me. Not in Julian's eyes, not in the carefully reconstructed paperwork that positioned him as the sole heir to his father's legacy, erasing 32 years of my strategic vision like chalk from a blackboard. I met Julian's eyes across the rosewood table. He expected resignation, gratitude even, for the generous severance. Instead, I smiled. "To everyone who's poured decades into something that never saw your true worth, this story is for you. Your value was never diminished by those who refused to acknowledge it. You were always meant to rise. But before I could rise, I had to learn just how deep the betrayal truly ran and how carefully it had been constructed. If you're with Mr. Douglas Tales, comment, 'I rise above every storm.' 32 years earlier, I'd been 26 and desperately trying to prove that an economics degree from Cambridge meant something more than privilege. Harrison had been 31, charismatic, but drowning in the logistics of a failing import business our father had left him. We'd met in his cramped office above a warehouse in Geneva, surrounded by bolts of fabric he couldn't sell and invoices he couldn't pay. "I need someone who understands numbers," he'd said, running a hand through hair already going grey from stress. "Someone I can trust, someone who sees what this could become." I saw it. God, did I see it. While Harrison handled the charm and public relations, I rebuilt everything from the foundation up. I created financial models that identified precisely which luxury segments were underserved. I developed relationships with artisan manufacturers who were producing extraordinary goods but lacked access to global markets. I structured our acquisitions to maximize value while preserving brand authenticity. Within 5 years, we'd gone from that cramped Geneva office to a headquarters in Zurich's financial district. Within 10, we'd acquired our first high-end fashion house. By year 15, we were courting investors for an expansion into luxury hospitality. "You're the architect," Harrison would say, always in private, always after another successful quarter. "I'm just the face people want to see." He'd pour expensive scotch, Macallan 25, acquired through a distillery connection I'd cultivated, and toast to the real brains of this operation. But in public, at galas where champagne flowed from crystal fountains and deals worth millions were sealed with handshakes, I was always introduced as my trusted advisor. Never partner, never co-founder. The equity agreements we'd signed in those early years somehow never translated into public acknowledgement. "It's about perception," Harrison explained when I finally asked, during our 20th year in business. "Investors want clear leadership, one vision. If I'm sharing credit, they see division, weakness." I'd accepted it. After all, the equity was protected in our agreements. My financial stake was secure. And Harrison's family, his wife Margot, his son Julian, they treated me like family. Every holiday, every celebration, I was there. Not as an employee, as family. When Harrison died of a sudden heart attack at 56, I'd wept as hard as Julian had. We'd buried him in the family plot outside Lucerne, and I'd delivered a eulogy that carefully omitted my own role in his success. That's what he would have wanted. Julian, 26 at the time and fresh from business school, had gripped my hand at the reception. "I'm going to need you now more than ever," he'd said, his voice thick with grief and determination. You knew how he thought. You know how this company works. Help me honor his legacy. Of course, I'd agreed. Harrison's son needed guidance. The company needed stability. And somewhere in my 50-year-old heart, I'd believed that Julian meant it, that he saw me the way his father had, as indispensable. For 8 years, I continued doing what I'd always done. I identified acquisition targets, I negotiated deals, I restructured operations, and I watched Julian step into his father's role with surprising competence, his confidence growing with each successful quarter. I didn't notice the subtle changes at first. The way Julian's assistant began requesting documentation for archival purposes. The closed-door meetings with the legal team. The gradual shift in how contracts were structured, with my review happening later and later in the process. I'd been focused on a major acquisition, a boutique hotel chain in the Alps that would diversify our portfolio beautifully. I'd spent 6 months building the relationship with the family owners, learning about their grandfather's vision, understanding their concerns about maintaining legacy while seeking financial security. When the deal closed, Julian held a celebration at one of our luxury properties in Gstaad. The ballroom glittered with enough wealth to fund a small nation. I wore my finest bespoke suit, Savile Row, charcoal grey, subtle enough to fade into the background as I'd learned to do. "To vision," Julian toasted, raising a flute of Dom Perignon 2008. "To the future of Kensington and Vale under bold new leadership." Bold new leadership, not continued leadership, not the team that made this possible. I smiled and drank the champagne, telling myself I was being oversensitive. After all, Julian was the CEO. He deserved the spotlight. But that night, as I watched him accept congratulations from board members and investors, I noticed something. He was introducing a woman I didn't recognize, late 30s, impeccably dressed in Chanel, confident smile. Our new chief strategy officer, he announced, bringing fresh perspectives to our growth planning. Strategy, my domain. The role I'd held unofficially for 3 decades. Her name was Lydia Castellane, Harvard Business School, 5 years at a prestigious consultancy. Impressive credentials, certainly, but she'd never built something from nothing. She'd never spent dawn to dusk hours in factories, learning why Italian silk required different handling than French lace. She'd never cultivated relationships across decades, earning trust one honest conversation at a time. I told myself it was expansion, not replacement. Julian needed more support as the company grew. That made sense. But the following Monday, when I arrived at headquarters for our usual strategic planning session, Julian's assistant intercepted me in the corridor. Mr. Julian asked me to let you know he'll be conducting strategic planning with Ms. Castellane this quarter. He'll reach out if he needs your input on anything specific. If he needed my input, after 32 years, I'd become conditional. I found the documents 3 weeks later, entirely by accident. I'd been searching my home office for the original contract from our first major acquisition, a French textile house we'd purchased in 1997. A potential new acquisition had similar terms, and I wanted to review how we'd structured the legacy provisions back then. My filing system was meticulous, developed over decades, chronological, then by deal type, then by specific terms. The 1997 contracts should have been in the third drawdown, in a folder labeled Acquisitions France. They weren't there. Confused, I checked the surrounding folders. That's when I found a manila envelope I didn't recognize tucked between 1996 and 1998, labeled only with a date, 8 years ago. 3 months after Harrison's death. Inside were copies of documents I'd never seen before. Amended partnership agreements, revised equity distributions, updated organizational structures, all dated within that first year after Harrison died, all filed with the Swiss Commercial Registry, all bearing official stamps and signatures. My name appeared in the first few pages of each document. Then, systematically, it vanished. Page by page, clause by clause, I watched my ownership stake dissolve through legal amendments I'd never approved. My founding role reclassified as advisory. My equity converted to performance-based consulting fees. My name removed from succession planning, from voting rights, from profit sharing above a certain threshold. The signatures were meticulous forgeries. My signature, practiced over 3 decades on hundreds of documents, reproduced with careful precision on agreements that stripped away everything Harrison and I had built together. I sat at my desk as night fell over Zurich, the city lights blurring through windows I couldn't remember opening. My hands, 58 years old, marked with age spots I'd started noticing last year, held paper that transformed my entire history into fiction. According to these documents, I'd never been a founder, never held substantial equity, never built anything. I was an advisor who'd been generously compensated for my services, nothing more. The question wasn't whether Julian had done this. The signature patterns, the timing, the systematic nature, this had taken years of careful planning. The question was, what did I do now? I could confront him directly, but without leverage, that would only accelerate my removal. I could take legal action, but contested signatures in Switzerland. That would take years, destroy the company's reputation, and potentially leave me with nothing but legal fees and damaged relationships. Or I could do what I'd spent 32 years doing: think strategically, plan carefully, and build my case brick by brick until it became irrefutable. I needed proof that predated these forgeries, original documents that establish my role beyond doubt. And I needed leverage, something Julian valued more than covering up his fraud. The next morning, I arrived at headquarters before dawn. The security guard, Stefan, who'd worked this shift for 12 years, nodded his usual greeting. "Early start, as always." "Old habits," I replied, smiling the smile I'd perfected over decades of being underestimated. Harrison's office, now Julian's, had been my first stop every morning for 32 years. We'd review the previous day, plan the current one, troubleshoot emerging issues over espresso from a machine I'd sourced from a small roastery in Milan. Julian had kept the espresso machine but changed everything else. The warm oak furniture I'd selected was gone, replaced with cold steel and glass. The family photos had been reduced to one: Harrison and Julian at Julian's business school graduation. No photos of the early days, when Harrison and I had worked 18-hour days in that Geneva warehouse. But one thing remained: the old filing cabinets Harrison had insisted on keeping, despite my suggestions to digitize. "Some things should stay analog," he'd said. "Harder to lose, harder to change." I'd bet my entire future on those cabinets still being here, still containing what I needed. They were pushed into a corner, clearly unused. Locked, but I still had my key from the old days. Harrison had given me a set to everything. "In case something happens to me," he'd said, joking, not knowing he'd die within 5 years of that conversation. The lock turned with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the quiet office. Inside, exactly where they should be, the original partnership agreements from 1993, the founding documents, the equity distributions, all bearing both our signatures, real ones, witnessed by a notary whose stamp I could verify, all establishing, beyond any doubt, that I'd built this company alongside Harrison. Not for him. I photographed each page with meticulous care, checking lighting and focus twice. These weren't just documents, they were my history, my proof, my weapon. "Looking for something?" I turned, unsurprised to find Lydia Castellane in the doorway. She was early too, apparently, or perhaps Julian had asked her to watch me. "Old memories," I said calmly, slipping my phone back into my jacket pocket. "Harrison and I stored some early documents here. Thought they might be interesting for the company history project." Her expression was carefully neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. Suspicion? Recognition? "Julian's implemented a new policy," she said. "All historical documents need to go through proper archival channels, for preservation purposes. For control purposes," she meant, for ensuring that inconvenient truths stayed buried. "Of course," I agreed. "I'll make sure to route everything appropriately." I walked past her, my phone heavy with evidence in my pocket. She called after me. "Julian wants to see you. 10 o'clock, his office." Not a meeting I'd scheduled. Not a request through his assistant. A summons. "I'll be there," I said. By 10 o'clock, I'd made several calls from my office. Door closed, voice low. The first was to Marcel Beaumont, a lawyer I'd worked with decades ago on international acquisitions. We'd kept in touch. I'd attended his daughter's wedding 2 years ago. I need an expert in Swiss commercial law and document fraud, I told him. Someone discreet, brilliant, and available immediately. Marcel didn't ask questions. I know someone, Françoise Durand. She's in Geneva, specializes in exactly this type of case. I'll send you her information. The second call was to Paolo Vincenzo, who owned the Italian textile house we'd acquired in 1995, one of our first major deals. Paolo and I had maintained a friendship over the years, based on mutual respect and a shared appreciation for craftsmanship over profit margins. Paolo, I said carefully, do you still have the original contracts from when we structured your company's acquisition? The ones we signed before the lawyers got involved? A pause. Then, the ones where you negotiated the heritage protections, where you made sure my family's legacy would be preserved? Yes, I keep those in my safe. Why? I may need them, I said, as proof of who actually built this company. Another pause, longer this time. Are you in trouble, my friend? Not yet, I said, but I'm preparing. At exactly 10 o'clock, I knocked on Julian's door. He was seated behind Harrison's old desk, the one piece of furniture he'd kept. Looking every inch the successful CEO in a Tom Ford suit I'd helped him select 6 months ago. Close the door, he said. I did. Then I sat in one of the uncomfortable steel chairs he'd installed, waiting. Julian steepled his fingers, a gesture I recognized from his father. But where Harrison had done it thoughtfully, Julian's version seemed rehearsed. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your role here, he began. I've been waiting for this conversation for 32 years, I replied calmly. That surprised him. Good. You've been an invaluable advisor, he continued, recovering. My father trusted you. I've trusted you. But the company is evolving. We need to make difficult decisions about removing the person who built what you're now trying to control, I finished. About erasing my ownership so completely that even I almost forgot I was a founder, not just an advisor. Silence. Julian's face betrayed nothing, but his knuckles whitened where his hands gripped the desk edge. I don't know what you think you found, he said carefully, but this company was my father's vision, his legacy. He built this from nothing. While I created the financial models, negotiated the acquisitions, restructured the operations, and turned his charm into an empire, I interrupted, my voice still calm. I have the original documents that prove it. Documents your forged amendments can't erase. His expression finally cracked. Not guilt, calculation. He was trying to determine how much I knew, how much I could prove. You're 58 years old, he said finally. Starting a legal battle now? It would take years. Destroy your reputation, destroy the company, everything my father built. Everything we built, I corrected. And you're right, a legal battle would be devastating for both of us, which is why we're going to find another solution. What do you want? What I earned, I said simply. Recognition of my founding role, restoration of my equity stake, and a position on the board with actual voting rights. Julian left, a cold sound. You think I'm going to hand over control of this company because you found some old paperwork? I think you're going to recognize that this company only has value if its foundation is legitimate, I said. And I'm prepared to prove, publicly if necessary, that its current foundation is built on fraud. He stood abruptly. Get out of my office. I stood too, slower, older, but not weaker. You have until the next board meeting to decide. Either we negotiate terms that honor the truth, or I start making phone calls to every investor, every partner, every regulatory body that should be interested in how this company rewrites its history. I left before he could respond, my heart pounding harder than it had in years. I'd just declared war on someone who controlled everything I'd built. But at 58, I'd learned something Julian hadn't. Patience was a weapon, experience was armor, and being underestimated was the ultimate advantage. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. No response from Julian, no further confrontation, nothing but the careful normalcy of a company running on autopilot, while underneath, foundations cracked. I used that time strategically. Every morning, I arrived at 6. Every evening, I left after Julian did, making sure I saw what he saw, heard what he heard. I documented everything. Meetings I was excluded from, decisions made without my input, the subtle ways my authority was being undermined. Françoise Durand, Marcel's recommendation, proved to be exactly what I needed. Sharp, discreet, and absolutely unimpressed by corporate power. We met at her Geneva office, a converted townhouse near the lake that smelled of old books and expensive coffee. She examined the documents I'd found, both the originals and the forgeries, with reading glasses perched on her nose and a red pen in hand. "The forgeries are good," she said eventually. "Professional quality, but they made mistakes. The notary stamp on the amended documents. That particular notary retired 6 months before the alleged signing date. The signature patterns are consistent with digital reproduction rather than natural variation, and the paper stock differs from what was standard for Swiss commercial filings during that period." Hope flickered. Enough to prove fraud? Enough to begin investigation, certainly. But here's what concerns me. You're fighting someone who controls the company's legal resources, its public relations, and potentially its financial records. He can afford to make this expensive and prolonged. "So what do you recommend?" Françoise leaned back, studying me over her glasses. "Build your position before you attack his. Gather allies, people whose testimony matters. Secure additional documentation. And most importantly, find something he wants more than keeping you silent. Something he wants more than silence." I turned that phrase over during the train ride back to Zurich, watching the Swiss countryside blur past at 200 kilometers per hour. What did Julian want? What mattered more to him than hiding his fraud? The answer came 3 days later, during a board meeting I'd expected to attend and wasn't invited to. I learned about it from Julian's assistant, a young woman named Claire, who'd always been professional to everyone, regardless of title. "I thought you should know," she said quietly, catching me in the corridor. "Mr. Julian is presenting plans for a merger with Rothschild Hospitality Group." Rothschild. The name hit like a thunderclap. One of the oldest luxury hospitality empires in Europe, privately held, legendarily selective about partnerships. A merger with them would catapult Kensington and Vale into a different stratosphere entirely. $15 billion combined valuation, access to properties in 30 countries, instant credibility in markets we'd barely touched. It was also the kind of deal that required absolute transparency in corporate structure. Rothschild's due diligence would be exhaustive. They'd examine every document, every agreement, every ownership stake. If my forged-out ownership came to light during that process, the merger would collapse. Julian would be exposed. Everything would unravel. There it was, the thing he wanted more than my silence. I needed to meet the Rothschilds, and I needed to understand exactly what Julian had promised them. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That evening, as I worked late reviewing acquisition reports in my office, my phone rang. An unknown number, Geneva area code. "This is Laurent Rothschild," the voice said, cultured, confident, with the particular accent of old European money. "I believe we should speak." My pulse quickened. Laurent Rothschild himself. Not an assistant, not a representative. The actual head of the family dynasty. "I'd be happy to meet," I said carefully. "Tonight, my hotel, the Metropole, 10 o'clock. Come alone." The line went dead before I could respond. The Metropole was old-world elegance incarnate, the kind of hotel where European royalty had negotiated treaties and corporate titans had sealed billion-dollar deals in velvet-draped salons. I arrived 5 minutes early, wearing my best suit and every ounce of confidence I'd accumulated over 3 decades. Laurent Rothschild received me in a private suite overlooking Lake Geneva. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, dressed in casual perfection that cost more than most people's monthly salary. "You're the architect," he said, without preamble, gesturing me toward a leather chair. The one Julian conveniently forgot to mention in his presentation. I sat, processing that statement. He mentioned me. He mentioned an advisor who'd been with the company for many years, but was transitioning out, Laurent said, pouring scotch, Macallan, naturally, into 2 crystal tumblers. But our due diligence team found something interesting. Every single deal that made Kensington and Vale successful, your signature is on the initial negotiations. Your name is in the thank you notes from acquired companies. Your relationships built the foundation. He slid 1 tumbler toward me. Yet, according to current corporate filings, you're just a consultant. So I wanted to understand, who actually built this company I'm considering merging with? This was the moment. I could expose Julian's fraud, collapse the merger, destroy everything, including my own future. Or I could build something better. "Harrison Kensington and I founded the company together," I said steadily. "I created the strategy, he provided the public presence. After his death, his son revised that history. I've been collecting proof of what actually happened." Laurent studied me over his scotch. "You could destroy this merger, expose the fraud. Why tell me instead of a lawyer?" "Because I don't want to destroy what I built," I said. "I want to reclaim it. And I think you want a partner you can trust." A smile flickered across Laurent's face. "Tell me about the Italian textile house, the one you acquired in 1995. For the next 2 hours, we talked. Not about legal documents or ownership stakes, but about the actual work of building luxury brands. Laurent asked questions that revealed deep understanding about supply chain authenticity, about preserving artisan relationships, about balancing growth with legacy. "Julian's presentation was impressive," Laurent said finally, "but it was all about numbers, growth projections, market share, expansion timelines. It lacked soul, the understanding of why this matters beyond profit." He refilled our glasses. "My family has maintained our reputation for 200 years by knowing exactly who we partner with. I don't partner with people who build empires on fraud, no matter how successful those empires appear." "So the merger is off," I said, trying to hide my disappointment. It would have been magnificent. "The merger with Julian Kensington is off," Laurent corrected, But the merger with the person who actually built something worth merging with? That interests me very much. I stared at him. You're suggesting? I'm suggesting you resolve your ownership situation, Laurent said. Prove publicly what you've proven to me privately. Take back what you built. And then we'll discuss partnership as equals. That could take months, years even. We've waited 200 years, Laurent said with a slight smile. We can wait for someone worth waiting for. He stood, extending his hand. I'll inform Julian tomorrow that we're declining to move forward. I won't mention this conversation. What you do with that information is your choice. I shook his hand, feeling the weight of possibility and responsibility settle across my shoulders. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Laurent said. Prove you deserve it. Chapter 4. Cracks in the Armour. Julian took the news of Rothschild's withdrawal exactly as poorly as I'd expected. I heard about it through the company grapevine before the official announcement. A closed-door meeting with Lydia Castellane that involved raised voices and, according to Claire, at least one item thrown against a wall. By lunch, he'd summoned me. Again, his office. Again, that calculated fury barely contained behind expensive tailoring. Did you speak to Laurent Rothschild? The question came before I'd even sat down. He called me, I said truthfully. Apparently their due diligence revealed some interesting discrepancies in our corporate structure. Julian's jaw clenched. What did you tell him? The truth, that I co-founded this company, that I've been systematically erased from its history, and that any legitimate partnership requires legitimate foundations. Silence crashed between us like breaking glass. You sabotaged a $15 billion deal, Julian finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. No, I corrected. You sabotaged it when you built it on fraud. I just gave Rothschild the information they needed to make an informed decision. You have no idea what you've done, he said. I know exactly what I've done. I've protected the company we built, your father and I, from being absorbed into something it wasn't ready for. And I've demonstrated that you can't move forward without addressing the past. Julian moved to the window, staring out at the city his father and I had conquered together. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. Not rage, but something harder. Resolution. You want your recognition? Fine, we'll negotiate. But not on your terms. On mine. I'm listening. The board meets in 3 weeks. I'll recommend restoring your equity stake. A percentage we'll negotiate. I'll publicly acknowledge your founding role. But in exchange, you'll sign documents confirming that all previous arrangements were made with your knowledge and consent. No fraud, no forgery, just evolution of the partnership. You want me to legitimize your theft? I want us both to walk away from this without destroying everything, Julian said, turning back to face me. You get equity, recognition, board position. I get to preserve my father's legacy without the stain of scandal. We both win. It was tempting. God, it was tempting. 3 weeks to resolution, equity restored, position secured. I could accept it, move forward, rebuild from there. But I'd spent 32 years being told to accept less than I deserved, being asked to hide my contributions for the sake of consistency, being told that what I'd earned wasn't really mine. No, I said. Julian's expression flickered. Surprise, then anger. No, I won't sign documents that rewrite history. Not again. If we negotiate, it's with the truth on the table. Complete documentation of what actually happened, full restoration of the original agreements, and public acknowledgement, Not of an evolved partnership, but of your attempted fraud. That would destroy me. That would hold you accountable, I said. There's a difference. For a long moment, Julian said nothing. Then, get out. Julian, get out, he repeated. And know this, if you want war, I'll give you war. I control this company. I control the board. I control the narrative. You're 58 years old with nothing but old documents and wounded pride. Try to fight me, and I'll ensure you're remembered as a bitter, delusional has-been who tried to steal credit for my father's genius. I stood slowly, my 58-year-old knees protesting slightly. Your father, I said quietly, would be ashamed of you. I left his office, knowing I'd just made an enemy of someone with significantly more resources than I had. But I also knew something Julian didn't understand yet. Resources mattered less than relationships, and I'd spent 32 years building relationships that ran deeper than corporate structure. Time to call in every favor. Time to prove that being underestimated was about to become Julian's greatest miscalculation. The Kensington and Vale annual gala had been my creation, an event designed not just to celebrate our success, but to deepen relationships with partners, artisans, and industry leaders. For 28 years, I'd personally overseen every detail, from the invitation list to the menu to the careful choreography of who sat where. This year, I hadn't been involved in planning. Lydia Castellane had taken over, reporting directly to Julian. According to Claire, who'd become an unexpected source of information, the gala was being reimagined as a celebration of new leadership and bold vision for the future. Translation, a celebration of Julian, with my contributions thoroughly erased. The invitation arrived at my apartment 2 weeks before the event. Late, I noted, a clear signal that my attendance was an afterthought. The venue, Château de Bellerive, a restored 18th century estate on Lake Geneva that we'd acquired 3 years ago and transformed into one of our premier properties. I'd negotiated that acquisition. I'd worked with local historians and craftsmen to ensure the restoration honored the chateau's heritage while meeting luxury standards. I'd personally selected the artworks now hanging in its galleries, sourcing pieces that told the story of Swiss textile history. Julian was using my own creation to celebrate my erasure. I RSVP'd immediately, attending +1. The +1 was strategic. I'd invited Françoise Durand, my lawyer, not as counsel, as a witness to whatever Julian had planned. The night of the gala, I dressed with deliberate care. My finest bespoke suit, midnight blue rather than my usual charcoal, tailored to emphasize shoulders that hadn't yet surrendered to age. A silk pocket square in deep burgundy, Italian leather shoes so well crafted, they looked better at 5 years old than new. I'd learned over 3 decades that in rooms full of power, presentation mattered. Not to impress, to signal that you belonged. Françoise met me at the chateau entrance, looking elegant in an understated black. You're sure about this? She murmured as we crossed the threshold into a ballroom, glittering with enough wealth to fund several small nations. Not even slightly, I admitted, but I'm here anyway. The ballroom was transformed. Lydia's work, I could see immediately. Modern, where I would have chosen classic. Bold, where I would have suggested subtle. Not bad, just different. A visual declaration that the old ways were gone. Julian stood near the centre, holding court among board members and investors. He saw me enter, and his expression barely changed. Just a slight tightening around his eyes. What he didn't see was the reaction from others in the room. Paolo Vincenzo, the Italian textile manufacturer, immediately moved toward me with a warm smile. "Finally, someone worth talking to," he exclaimed, embracing me with genuine warmth. Others followed. The Swiss watchmaker, whose company we'd acquired 8 years ago. The French perfumer who'd trusted us with her family recipes. The Japanese ceramicist who'd partnered with us on a limited collection. One by one, the artisans and partners I'd cultivated over decades gravitated toward me, their greetings genuine and public. Across the room, I could see Lydia watching this with growing unease. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. Julian was meant to be the star, the visionary leader. Instead, the people who actually created the luxury we sold were gathering around the person Julian had tried to erase. "I've been meaning to ask," Paolo said, his voice carrying to nearby conversations, "who approved the changes to our heritage requirements, the ones that allow synthetic blends in our signature line?" I stiffened. "What changes?" Paolo's expression darkened. 3 months ago, we received new production guidelines, allowing up to 15% synthetic fibers in textiles previously guaranteed to be pure natural materials. It violates everything we agreed to when you negotiated our acquisition. Around us, other partners were nodding. The watchmaker. Similar changes to our quality standards. The perfumer. Pressure to increase production volume at the expense of aging time. I glanced toward Julian, who was watching this gathering with barely concealed frustration. He'd been cutting corners, sacrificing the authenticity that made our acquisitions valuable, probably to boost short-term margins for potential deals like Rothschild. "Those changes," I said clearly, letting my voice carry, "violate the heritage agreements I negotiated with each of you. Agreements that were supposed to be protected in perpetuity." "We assumed you'd approved them," Paolo said, "since you negotiated the originals. But when I tried to reach you for clarification, I was told you were no longer involved in heritage preservation decisions." The conversation around us had quieted. Other guests were listening now, including several board members. "That's correct," Julian's voice cut across the ballroom as he approached. "We've restructured certain advisory roles to reflect current strategic priorities. Heritage standards are being reviewed by qualified teams who understand modern market realities." "Modern market realities?" Paolo's voice rose. "You mean sacrificing quality for profit? Destroying the authenticity that makes our partnership valuable?" "I mean adapting to competitive pressures," Julian said smoothly. "Maintaining relevance requires evolution." "It requires integrity," I said quietly. Every eye in our corner of the ballroom turned toward me. When I negotiated these partnerships, I promised that Kensington and Vale would protect what made each craft special, that we'd grow without compromising authenticity. Breaking those promises doesn't make us competitive, it makes us fraudulent. The word hung in the air, fraudulent, loaded with double meaning that Julian couldn't miss. "Perhaps," Lydia Castellane interjected, appearing at Julian's elbow, "this conversation would be more appropriate in a private setting." "No," Laurent Rothschild's voice joined the discussion. I hadn't seen him arrive, but there he was, glass of champagne in hand, expression thoughtful. "I think this conversation is extremely appropriate for this setting. Transparency in business relationships is the foundation of trust." Julian's face went carefully blank. "Mr. Rothschild, I didn't know you'd accepted our invitation." "I didn't," Laurent said. I came as someone's guest. He nodded toward me. And I'm finding the evening quite illuminating. The crowd around us had grown. More board members, investors, partners, all watching this confrontation unfold with varying degrees of understanding and discomfort. If I might, one of the board members, Richard Wexler, who'd been on the board since the early days, spoke up. I'm concerned about what I'm hearing. Our reputation is built on authenticity. If we're compromising the very agreements that made our acquisition successful, he looked directly at Julian. Perhaps we need to revisit some recent strategic decisions. Julian's jaw clenched. This is neither the time nor the place. Actually, Richard continued, this seems like exactly the time. We're here to celebrate the company's success. Understanding how we maintain that success seems relevant. He turned to me. You negotiated these heritage agreements originally. Can you verify whether the modifications our partners are describing violate the original terms? I had a choice in that moment. I could back down, avoid public confrontation, handle this privately. That's what I'd done for 32 years. Or I could tell the truth. Yes, I said clearly. They violate both the letter and spirit of the original agreements. Those agreements were designed to protect authenticity as our core value. Modifying them without consent from the original partners and without involvement from the person who negotiated them represents a fundamental breach of trust. You were informed, Julian said tightly, through appropriate channels. I was informed I was no longer relevant to heritage preservation, I corrected. That's different from informed consent to changes that undermine everything we built. Richard looked troubled. Julian, I think we need to schedule an emergency board meeting. There are clearly issues that need addressing. Around us, I could see other board members nodding. The careful foundation Julian had built, of positioning me as dispensable, of justifying changes as natural evolution, was cracking in real time. This is sabotage, Julian said, his voice low enough that only those immediately nearby could hear. You're trying to undermine me in front of... I'm answering questions honestly, I interrupted, something you might consider trying. For a moment, I thought Julian might lose control entirely. His fists clenched, his face flushed. Then Lydia touched his arm, whispering something, and he forced his expression into neutrality. Fine, he said. Board meeting next week. We'll address all concerns formally. He looked directly at me. And we'll establish, once and for all, who actually leads this company. He walked away, Lydia trailing behind, leaving me surrounded by partners, board members, and Laurent Rothschild, who was smiling slightly. Well played, Laurent said quietly. That wasn't playing, I replied. That was truth. The best moves usually are. Pause with me here. If you've ever been underestimated, sidelined, or told your contributions don't matter, you're not alone. What happens next will show you why falling isn't failing, and why the truth, spoken at the right moment, is more powerful than any deception. Hit subscribe to join this family at Mr. Douglas Tales. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the intervening days preparing with Françoise, gathering documentation, rehearsing presentations. We had the original partnership agreements, testimony from partners about heritage violations, and Laurent Rothschild's willingness to explain why he'd declined the merger. It should have been enough. God knows, it should have been enough. Monday evening, I was working late in my apartment, reviewing my presentation one final time, when my phone rang. Françoise. "We have a problem," she said, without preamble. "A significant one." My stomach dropped. "Tell me." Julian's legal team filed an injunction this afternoon. They're claiming the documents you copied from his office constitute theft of company property. They're arguing that any evidence obtained through unauthorized access to confidential files should be inadmissible in any proceeding. "Those were my documents," I said, "records of my own partnership." "Located in his private office, in locked cabinets, accessed with a key you weren't supposed to still have," Françoise replied. "He's painting you as a disgruntled employee stealing confidential information to manufacture false claims." "That's absurd. Harrison gave me those keys." "Can you prove that? Do you have documentation of Harrison authorizing your access to his office files?" Silence. Of course I didn't. It had been an informal arrangement, built on trust, not documentation. "The judge granted a temporary restraining order," Françoise continued. "You're prohibited from sharing, distributing, or presenting the documents you photographed until the court rules on their admissibility. And Julian's team is very good at delaying court rulings. So tomorrow's board meeting, without those documents, you have no proof of your founding role, no evidence of the forgeries, just your word against his, and he controls the current documentation." I sat down heavily, staring at my laptop screen, full of carefully prepared slides, now useless. "He's checkmated me." "Not necessarily," Françoise said. "We can still present testimony from partners about the heritage violations. We can still demonstrate mismanagement. But proving your ownership stake, that becomes much harder without the original documents. In other words, I can damage him, but I can't prove my own case." "In other words," Françoise agreed, "mutual destruction." "Which might be exactly what he's counting on, that you'll back down rather than destroy the company you built." She was right, and Julian knew me well enough to know she was right. But that realization came with another. Julian had just shown me exactly how ruthless he was willing to be. The gloves were off. Any remaining sentiment I'd held for Harrison's son evaporated. "Françoise," I said slowly, "the injunction covers documents I took from his office. What about documents other people already have?" A pause. "Documents you'd previously shared with third parties before his legal action. Those wouldn't be covered by the restraining order." "And if someone like Paolo Vincenzo happened to have copies of our original acquisition agreements, the ones establishing heritage protections and my role as negotiator, those would be his property to share as he sees fit." "Indeed they would," Françoise said, understanding in her voice. "And if multiple partners happen to have similar documentation, then the board would see a pattern of my involvement that predates any questionable access to Julian's office." "I'll adjust tomorrow's strategy accordingly," Françoise said. "Though you should know, Julian also filed formal complaints with the Swiss Commercial Registry, questioning the validity of your claims and suggesting you're suffering from age-related decline in judgment." That one hit harder than the legal maneuvering. Age-related decline, at 58, the ultimate dismissal, not just wrong, but too old to be trusted. "He's trying to destroy my credibility," I said quietly. "He's trying to destroy you," Françoise corrected. "The question is whether we let him." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment's darkness, Zurich's lights spreading below like a map of everything I'd helped build. 32 years of work, relationships, strategic vision, all being weaponized against me by someone who'd inherited everything without earning any of it. My phone rang again. This time, Paolo. I heard about the legal situation, he said, without preamble. Absolute nonsense. And I want you to know, I still have every document from our original negotiations. Letters, agreements, notes, all showing your central role. If you need them for tomorrow, they're yours. Thank you, I managed. Don't thank me. You protected my family's legacy when you didn't have to. Now I'm returning the favor. A pause. Also, I spoke with others. The watchmaker, the perfumer, the ceramicist. We're all attending tomorrow's meeting, all bringing our documentation, all prepared to testify about who actually built the relationships Julian is now damaging. After we hung up, more calls came. Partner after partner, each offering documentation, each prepared to stand witness to my role. People I'd worked with for decades, relationships I'd cultivated with care and integrity. Julian had resources, but I had relationships, and sometimes that mattered more. Tuesday morning arrived with unusual clarity, one of those autumn days when Zurich's air sharpens everything into high contrast. I dressed with the same care I'd taken for the gala, confidence expressed through details. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 at headquarters. I arrived 30 minutes early to find Paolo, the watchmaker, the perfumer, and 3 other long-term partners already waiting in the lobby. Each carried folders of documents. Each wore expressions of determined support. We go in together, Paolo said simply. The boardroom, the one I'd designed 30 years ago, was already filled when we entered. Board members occupied their usual seats. Julian sat at the head of the table, Lydia beside him, and flanking them were 4 men in expensive suits I didn't recognize. Julian's legal team, presumably. What surprised me was seeing Laurent Rothschild seated among the board members. He must have been invited as a potential investor, giving him observer status. Julian's expression tightened as he saw the group of partners file in with me. This is a closed board meeting, he said. These individuals weren't invited. They're material witnesses to the company's history and current operations, Françoise replied, appearing behind us with her own team. Given that this meeting concerns ownership structure and operational integrity, their presence is not only appropriate, but necessary. Richard Wexler, the board member who'd spoken up at the gala, nodded. I'd like to hear what they have to say. This meeting was called to address concerns raised at the gala. Let's address them comprehensively. Julian looked to his lawyers, who conferred briefly. One leaned over and whispered something. Julian's jaw clenched, but he nodded curtly. Fine, let's proceed. For the next 3 hours, the boardroom became a courtroom of sorts. Françoise presented, without using the documents from Julian's office, a timeline of my involvement in building the company. Paolo and the other partners testified, providing documentation of their original negotiations with me. Letters I'd written, contracts I'd structured, notes proving my strategic role. Then came testimony about the heritage violations. Specific examples of how Julian's modifications undermined the authenticity that made each acquisition valuable. The watchmaker brought examples of quality control changes that violated Swiss manufacturing standards we'd promised to maintain. The perfumer detailed pressure to accelerate aging processes that would compromise scent complexity. The board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. These weren't abstract concerns. These were concrete examples of the company's reputation being damaged for short-term financial gain. Julian's lawyers tried to redirect, arguing that operational changes were within management's purview, that adaptation was necessary for competitiveness. But Paolo shut that down with quiet ferocity. "You want to know why we're here?" Paolo said, standing to address the board directly. "Because this person," he gestured to me, "spent weeks in my factory, learning our processes, understanding our history. They promised that Kensington and Vale would protect what made us special while helping us grow. That promise was the only reason I sold. Now that promise is being broken by someone who's never set foot in my factory, who wouldn't know quality silk if it was wrapped around his expensive neck." Silence fell. Hard. Julian recovered quickly. "With respect to Mr. Vincenzo's passion, business, realities change. We cannot be bound by agreements made decades ago to accommodate modern." "Those agreements are legally binding," Francoise interrupted, "and violating them opens the company to substantial liability. More importantly, they reveal a pattern of disregarding foundational commitments, which brings us to the central question: who actually established those foundations?" She presented her evidence carefully: documentation from partners, testimony about my role, analysis of signature patterns on various agreements over 30 years, building a picture not of a consultant, but of a co-founder whose contributions had been systematically minimized. When she finished, Richard Wexler spoke. "I've been on this board for 15 years. I remember when Harrison was alive, how he would always say, 'I need to check with my partner before major decisions.' I assumed he meant his business partner, but the documentation suggests he meant his sibling, who was never formally recognized as such." "My father used partner loosely," Julian interjected, "as a courtesy to a trusted advisor, nothing more." "Then why," Laurent Rothschild's voice cut in, "do all the acquisition documents from your first decade show equal authority between Harrison and," he looked at me, "his sibling? Why are both signatures required on contracts through 2005? And why, after Harrison's death, were those requirements quietly changed?" Julian's lawyer stood. "Mr. Rothschild, with respect, you're not a board member, and—" "I'm a potential investor conducting due diligence," Laurent said calmly. "And I'm finding significant discrepancies between the company's stated history and its documented reality. Discrepancies that would make any merger or significant investment extremely problematic." That got the board's attention. Potential investment meant potential value, exactly what they were there to protect. "What are you proposing?" another board member asked Laurent. "I'm proposing that before anyone discusses partnerships or investments, this company clarify its own internal situation," Laurent said, "starting with an independent audit of ownership structure, going back to founding." "That would take months," Julian protested, "and cost." "Less than a lawsuit," Richard said bluntly, "and significantly less than the reputational damage of this becoming public before we've addressed it. I move that we commission an independent audit." "Second," another board member said immediately. The vote was swift: 7 in favor, 2 opposed, 1 abstention. Julian's face was stone. "Additionally," Richard continued, "I move that pending the audit's results, all major strategic decisions require board approval, including operational changes affecting heritage agreements." That vote passed 8-2. Julian stood abruptly. "You're stripping me of operational authority based on accusations from someone with obvious bias and questionable mental capacity." We're protecting the company's interests, Richard corrected, which is our fiduciary duty. The audit will determine facts. Until then, we proceed cautiously. Julian's eyes found mine across the table. The hatred there was palpable. This isn't over, he said quietly. No, I agreed. It isn't. But as I walked out of that boardroom, surrounded by partners who'd stood with me, with an independent audit commissioned and operational controls in place, I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 years. Hope. What I didn't know was that Julian's next move had already been set in motion, and it would target not my business standing, but something far more personal. The article appeared 3 days later in a prominent financial publication. Dynasty in decline. Allegations of elder manipulation in luxury empire. I discovered it when my phone started ringing at 6 in the morning. Journalists, colleagues, even old university friends I hadn't spoken to in years, all asking the same question. Was it true? The article was masterfully constructed character assassination. It portrayed me as an aging advisor who'd spent decades in the shadow of a brilliant CEO, developing an increasingly distorted view of my own contributions. It quoted anonymous sources, colleagues who've worked closely with the individual for years, expressing concern about memory lapses, confusion during meetings, grandiose claims about past achievements. The piece suggested I'd been quietly removed from active roles due to these concerns, but had reacted with accusations and manufactured evidence. It painted Julian as a compassionate leader, trying to protect both me and the company from the embarrassment of my decline. Most damningly, it included statements from a medical expert, unnamed for privacy reasons, suggesting that individuals experiencing age-related cognitive decline often develop complex false narratives to explain their diminishing role, sometimes including accusations of conspiracy or theft. The article never stated outright that I was suffering from dementia. It didn't have to. The implication was devastating enough. My phone kept ringing. By noon, I'd stopped answering. By evening, I'd turned it off entirely. Francoise arrived at my apartment unannounced, letting herself in with the emergency key I'd given her for document storage purposes. She found me on my balcony, staring at the city, holding a glass of Harrison's favourite scotch, the Macallan, 25, that I'd been saving for a celebration that now seemed unlikely to ever come. "This is libel," she said without preamble. "Clear, actionable libel. We can sue." "Can we win?" I asked, not looking at her. A pause. "Eventually, but the legal process would take years. And in the meantime, the damage is already done," I finished. Every board member who was starting to believe me, now they'll question everything. Was I really as involved as I claimed? Or am I a confused old person rewriting history? The partners still support you. Paolo called me 3 times today, furious about the article. "The partners aren't on the board," I said. "They can't vote on my ownership claims. And now, even if the audit proves everything I've said is true, Julian has planted the seed. Maybe I wasn't competent when I built all this. Maybe I didn't actually do what I remember doing. Maybe I'm just old and confused." Francoise sat down beside me. "So what do you want to do?" I finally looked at her. "I want to know if he's won. If this is the move that ends it. Because I'm 58, Francoise. I've spent 32 years building something, and now I'm being told I might not even be mentally competent enough to remember building it. How do I fight that?" "You fight it the same way you've fought everything else," she said. "With evidence, with truth. with the fact that everyone who's actually worked with you knows this article is nonsense. But will they say that publicly? Or will they see the risk in associating themselves with someone who's been labelled as potentially incompetent? She didn't answer immediately, because we both knew the truth. Courage was rare when reputations were at stake. That night, after Francoise left, I sat in my apartment reading the article again and again. Each reading found new ways it undermined everything I'd worked toward. The suggestion that I'd always been just an advisor who'd inflated my role, the implication that Harrison had tolerated my presence out of family loyalty, not business necessity, the careful construction of doubt around every achievement I'd claimed. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Julian had learned from his attempts to silence me. Direct confrontation gave me power. Better to undermine my credibility entirely, to make every word from me suspect. Around midnight, my phone, turned back on to check for messages from Francoise, rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me. "Read the article," Claire's voice said, Julian's assistant, speaking in whispers. "Wanted you to know it's not true. Everyone in this office knows it's not true. Julian worked with his PR team for 2 weeks on it. They planted those anonymous sources. The medical expert, paid consultant who never met you." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I've watched you work for 3 years," she said. "I've seen you remember details from deals made decades ago. I've watched you solve problems Julian can't even understand. You're not declining. You're being destroyed. And it's wrong. Claire, if Julian finds out you called me—" "I'm already looking for new positions," she interrupted. "I don't want to work for someone who does this. But I wanted you to know. You're not alone. And you're not crazy. You're just fighting someone without a conscience." The line went dead. I sat in the darkness, Claire's words echoing. "You're not crazy." Such simple words, but in that moment, they mattered more than all. The documentation and legal strategies combined. Because Julian had done something worse than challenging my ownership. He'd challenged my reality, my memory, my sanity. And at 58, with a career's worth of grey hair and age spots marking my hands, that attack found purchase in ways a younger person might not understand. Was I remembering correctly? Had I really been as central as I thought? Or had decades of being underappreciated distorted my perception? No. The thought came clearly, decisively. No. I knew what I'd built. I remembered every negotiation, every late night, every strategic decision that had turned Harrison's struggling import business into a luxury empire. The details were too specific, too technical, too numerous to be fabrication. Julian was counting on self-doubt, on the fear that comes with age, the worry that memory might betray you, that your contributions might be forgotten or minimized or erased. But I wasn't doubting, not anymore. I'd spent 3 decades being told to hide my contributions, to accept less recognition, to fade into the background for the sake of someone else's image. And I'd accepted it because I'd believed it served a greater purpose. But Julian had just shown me that accepting less than I deserved had never been noble. It had been naive. Because the moment I tried to claim what was mine, he'd attempted to destroy not just my case, but my identity. The realization settled into my bones like steel. I wasn't fighting for equity or recognition anymore. I was fighting for the right to be believed about my own life. And that was a fight I couldn't afford to lose. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 32 years. I called in sick. Not because I was ill, but because I needed time to think without the distraction of the office, without Julian's surveillance, without the careful performance of normalcy. I needed to rebuild my strategy from the ground up. Francoise arrived at my apartment at 9, carrying coffee and a look of fierce determination. "We're not giving up," she announced before I could say anything. "I wasn't planning to," I replied, "but we need a different approach. Julian's turned this into a war of perception, and perception battles can't be won with documents alone." "So what do you propose?" I'd spent the night thinking, planning, drawing on 3 decades of strategic experience to map out a path forward. Julian's weakness is the same as his strength. He's never actually built anything. He inherited a successful company, and he's been coasting on Harrison's legacy. But he doesn't understand the relationships that made that success possible. "The partners," Francoise said, understanding. "Not just the partners. Every supplier, every distributor, every craftsman we've worked with over 30 years. Julian sees them as transactional relationships, but I built personal connections, real trust, and trust is harder to fake than signatures." I pulled out a legal pad, covered in notes from my sleepless night. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we need a public response to that article. Not a defensive denial, but a proactive demonstration of competence. I'm going to call a press conference." Francoise looked skeptical. "That could backfire. If you seem defensive—" "I won't be defensive. I'll be transparent. I'll present specific examples of my work, deals I negotiated, relationships I built, problems I solved, not claims, evidence. And I'll invite journalists to verify every detail." "That's bold. That's necessary. Julian's counting on me staying quiet, letting his narrative dominate. Instead, I'm going to demonstrate exactly how sharp my memory and judgment are." I continued. "Second, we're going to accelerate the audit. Instead of waiting for the board's independent auditor, I'm commissioning my own, paid for with my personal funds. Complete forensic analysis of every document in the company's history. When the board's audit eventually confirms what mine shows, it eliminates any suggestion that I'm manipulating the process." "That will be expensive." "I have savings," I said. "Harrison made sure I was well compensated, even if equity was denied. Time to use those resources." "Third," Francoise prompted. "Third, we go on offense. We file formal complaints with the commercial registry about the forged documents. We request investigation into how those forgeries were filed. We force Julian to defend his actions rather than attack mine." Francoise was making notes. "This could work, but it requires perfect execution. One misstep, and Julian will use it as evidence of your supposed decline." "Then we won't misstep," I said simply. Over the next 2 days, we executed the plan with military precision. I hired the forensic auditors Francoise recommended, a Swiss firm with an impeccable reputation and no ties to either side. They began their work immediately, accessing company records through legal channels that the board's audit restrictions didn't cover. I prepared for the press conference by compiling specific examples of my work. The Italian textile acquisition in 1995, complete with letters from Paolo documenting my role. The French perfumery deal in 2003, with testimony from the founder about how I'd structured heritage protections. The Swiss watchmaker partnership from 2016, with detailed notes from negotiation sessions showing my strategic input. Each example was verifiable, specific, and demonstrated both sharp memory and strategic thinking, not the work of someone experiencing cognitive decline. The press conference was scheduled for Friday afternoon at a neutral venue, a hotel conference room in Geneva, far from company headquarters. I invited every business journalist in Switzerland, sent detailed backgrounders, and made it clear this was about corporate governance and integrity, not personal grievances. Thursday evening, the night before the conference, Laurent Rothschild called. "I heard about your press conference tomorrow," he said. "Brave move." "Necessary move," I corrected. "I want you to know, I've been conducting my own inquiry into Kensington and Vale's history. Your version of events aligns with every piece of independent documentation I've found. Julian's version requires accepting multiple convenient coincidences and unexplained administrative changes." "Will you say that publicly?" I asked. "Not yet, but when the time comes, when you've proven your case definitively, I'll be ready to discuss partnership on your terms." "Why are you helping me?" I asked. "You barely know me." "I know your work," Laurent said simply. "And in my family's business, we've learned that people who build things with integrity are rare, worth investing in, worth defending." After we hung up, I looked at my reflection in the darkening window. 58 years old, fighting the biggest battle of my life, but no longer alone. Claire's covert support, Paolo and the partners' public testimony, Françoise's strategic brilliance, Laurent's quiet backing. Julian had resources, but I had something more valuable. I had people who'd chosen to believe in me, despite the risks. Friday arrived clear and cold. I dressed for the press conference with extreme care. A suit that projected authority without ostentation, glasses that emphasized rather than hid my age, let them see the experience, a posture that communicated confidence without arrogance. The conference room was packed, more journalists than I'd expected, plus several people I didn't immediately recognize. And in the back, trying to appear inconspicuous, Julian and Lydia. Good. Let him see this. I began with a simple statement. My name is Kensington, Harrison's sibling. 32 years ago, my brother and I founded a textile import business in Geneva. This afternoon, I'm going to prove that statement with documentation, testimony, and specific examples that anyone here can verify. For the next hour, I walk them through the company's history. Not a general narrative, but specific deals with specific dates, documented with letters, contracts, and testimonials from partners who were present for the negotiations. I presented my forensic audit's preliminary findings, showing signature pattern analysis that proved recent forgeries. Most importantly, I answered every question with precision and detail that demonstrated not just memory, but comprehensive understanding of complex business operations. One journalist asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Mr. Kensington's team has raised concerns about your mental capacity. How do you respond?" "I respond with evidence," I said calmly. "I've presented specific, verifiable information about deals spanning 3 decades. I've answered detailed questions about supply chains, financial structures, and international partnerships. If anyone in this room believes those responses indicate cognitive decline, I invite them to explain what competence would look like instead." Silence. Then someone in the back, not Julian, but one of the other journalists, began clapping. Others joined. Not everyone, but enough. After the conference, as journalists filed out and I gathered my materials, Julian approached. Lydia tried to stop him, But he shook her off. "You think you've won," he said quietly, "but all you've done is guarantee mutual destruction." "No," I said. "All I've done is guarantee the truth comes out. What happens after that is up to you. We can negotiate honestly, restore what should have been mine all along, and move forward, or we can let the courts and auditors decide. But either way, I'm done being erased." Julian stared at me for a long moment. Then, without another word, he left. 2 weeks later, the preliminary audit results came back. Every claim I'd made was verified, every forgery identified, every systematic erasure documented. The board called an emergency meeting. This time I was invited, not as a supplicant, but as a participant in determining the company's future. The emergency board meeting took place on a Tuesday morning that felt like a reckoning. The preliminary audit results had been distributed to all board members 48 hours prior. I'd read mine 3 times, not because I needed to understand the findings, but because I needed to absorb the reality that someone independent, someone without stake in the outcome, had confirmed everything. The forged signatures were documented with forensic precision. The systematic removal of my name from agreements was mapped chronologically. The pattern of changes, all occurring within the first 2 years after Harrison's death, was laid out in undeniable detail. Most damningly, the audit had discovered something even I hadn't known: email correspondence between Julian and a document specialist in Luxembourg, discussing administrative corrections to historical filings, with payment records showing substantial fees for legacy restructuring services. He'd paid someone to help him erase me. The boardroom was arranged differently this time. Richard Wexler sat at the head of the table instead of Julian. Julian and Lydia were positioned to one side, no longer commanding center position. Françoise sat beside me, legal pads and laptop ready. Laurent Rothschild was present again, his observer status apparently made permanent pending resolution. Richard called the meeting to order with somber formality. "We're here to address findings from the independent audit commissioned 2 weeks ago. I want to be clear. This board takes fiduciary responsibility seriously. Our job is to protect the company's interests, which means protecting its integrity and legal standing." He gestured to the audit team's lead investigator, who'd been invited to present findings directly. For 45 minutes, the investigator walked through the evidence with clinical precision. Forged signatures identified through pressure analysis and ink composition. Notary stamps from officials who'd retired before the document's alleged dates. Paper stock inconsistencies. Email records documenting Julian's involvement. The investigator's conclusion was delivered without emotion. "In our professional opinion, the evidence indicates deliberate, systematic fraud designed to alter corporate ownership structure without the knowledge or consent of a co-founder." Silence filled the room like a physical presence. Julian's lawyer stood. "These findings rely on assumptions about document age and technical analysis that are standard forensic practice," the investigator interrupted, "and have been used successfully in courts throughout Europe. The methodology is sound. The evidence is clear." Richard looked directly at Julian. "Do you have a response?" Julian's face was carefully controlled, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. Fight and lose publicly, or concede and negotiate damage control? "The changes to corporate structure were made in good faith," he said finally, "to reflect the operational reality of my father's leadership role. Any administrative irregularities were unintentional. You paid a document specialist in Luxembourg $47,000 over 18 months, Richard interrupted, reading from the audit report. The email correspondence explicitly discusses removing the founding partner from official records and restructuring equity to reflect sole heir status. That's not good faith. That's fraud. Julian's lawyer tried again. My client's intentions don't matter, Francoise said, speaking for the first time. Swiss commercial law is clear about documentation requirements. Forging signatures and filing false documents with the registry is criminal fraud, regardless of claimed intentions. Another board member spoke up, Katharina Müller, who'd been quiet during previous meetings. What exposure does this create for the company? Significant, Francoise replied. If this becomes public before resolution, we're looking at regulatory investigation, potential criminal charges against Mr. Julian, shareholder lawsuits, and reputational damage that could affect partnerships and property values. So what do you propose? Richard asked, looking between me and Julian. I'd prepared for this moment. Francoise and I had mapped out exactly what we wanted, what we'd accept, and what we'd fight for. Complete restoration of the original founding agreements, I said. Public acknowledgement of my co-founder status. Equity stake restored to 1993 levels, which would be approximately 32% based on current valuation. Board seat with voting rights, and formal correction of all falsified documents in the commercial registry. Julian's face went pale. That's $1.4 billion in equity value. That's what I earned, I said simply. That's what the original agreement specified. That's what was stolen from me through forged documents. The company doesn't have that kind of liquidity. I'm not asking for cash, I interrupted. I'm asking for proper equity stake, with appropriate voting rights and profit participation. The structure Harrison and I agreed to 32 years ago. That would dilute my ownership to minority status, Julian protested. That would restore accurate ownership, Richard corrected. The ownership that should have been in place all along. Katharina leaned forward. Let's be clear about our options. If we don't resolve this internally, we're facing legal action that will expose everything. The fraud, the forgeries, the deliberate erasure. That destroys any chance of partnerships, attracts regulatory scrutiny, and potentially results in criminal prosecution. She looked at Julian. Or we can negotiate a settlement that acknowledges wrongdoing, restores proper ownership, and allows the company to move forward with its integrity intact. Those are the choices. Julian's lawyer whispered urgently to him. Julian shook his head, whispered back. The lawyer's expression grew more concerned. Finally, Julian spoke. I need time to consider. No more time, Richard said firmly. The audit is complete. The evidence is clear. This board has a fiduciary duty to address fraud immediately, not to allow it to continue while the perpetrator considers consequences. He pulled out a prepared document. I'm recommending that this board vote on the following resolution. Acknowledge the findings of the independent audit. Restore the original 1993 founding agreements. Recognize co-founder status for both Harrison Kensington and his sibling. Implement appropriate equity correction and refer the matter of document fraud to appropriate authorities. You can't, Julian started. We can, Richard said, and we must. The company's survival depends on operating with integrity, not protecting fraud. The vote was called. 7 in favour, 2 opposed, 1 abstention. Julian stood abruptly. I'll contest this. I'll. You'll do what? Richard asked. Fight an audit that proves you committed fraud? Explain to regulators why you shouldn't be prosecuted? Destroy the company your father built, rather than share what was never entirely yours? For a long moment, Julian said nothing. Then, quietly, I want immunity from prosecution as part of any settlement. Ah, there it was. The calculation I'd been waiting for. That's negotiable, Francois said. Conditional on complete cooperation with equity restoration, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and resignation from CEO position. Resignation? Julian's voice rose. This is my company. This is a company you tried to steal, I said, speaking for the first time directly to him. And the price of avoiding prosecution is stepping aside while people who actually understand integrity rebuild what you've damaged. Julian looked around the table. Every board member's expression was implacable. He'd lost. And he knew it. I need to consult with my attorneys, he said finally. You have 48 hours, Richard said. After that, we proceed with regulatory filings, regardless of your cooperation. The meeting adjourned. As people filed out, Laurent Rothschild approached me. Well played, he said quietly. When this settles, call me. We have a merger to discuss. I nodded, unable to speak. Because after 32 years of being erased, marginalized, and forgotten, I'd just won the right to be accurately remembered. Julian didn't wait 48 hours. 36 hours after the board meeting, I received a call from his lawyers requesting an immediate meeting. Not at the office, at a neutral location, a conference room in a Geneva law firm. Francois advised caution. He's cornered. Cornered people are dangerous. He's also calculating, I replied, and the calculation says fighting costs more than settling. We arrived to find Julian already there, flanked by 3 attorneys. He looked diminished somehow, the confident CEO I'd watched grow into his father's role, replaced by someone who'd finally understood the difference between inheriting power and earning it. His lead attorney opened. My client is prepared to discuss settlement terms. We're listening, Francois said. For the next 3 hours, we negotiated. Not from positions of equality. I had evidence, board support, and moral authority, but Julian had one final card to play: publicity. He could make this ugly, drag the company's reputation through investigations and trials, even if he ultimately lost. His attorneys proposed terms: restore my equity stake, but at 20% instead of 32%. Public acknowledgement of my significant contribution as a co-founder. No criminal prosecution. Julian retains CEO position, but with board oversight. No, I said simply. Julian's attorney looked surprised. These are generous terms given that your client committed fraud, Francois interrupted. Let's be clear. We're not negotiating whether wrongdoing occurred. That's established. We're negotiating whether your client faces criminal prosecution. My client is willing to make this right. By offering me 2/3 of what I actually earned, I said. By keeping his position despite proven fraud. By framing my role as merely significant when I built this company alongside his father. I leaned forward. Here are my terms, non-negotiable. Full 32% equity stake as specified in original agreements. Public statement acknowledging systematic erasure of my founding role and the fraudulent documentation. Julian's resignation from CEO position. He can remain on the board, but not in executive authority. And formal correction of all commercial registry filings. And in exchange, Julian's attorney asked. In exchange, we don't pursue criminal charges. We characterize the situation as administrative irregularities in public statements, and we work together to ensure company stability during transition. Julian finally spoke. You want me to publicly admit fraud and give up the company my father built. I want you to publicly admit fraud and give up control of the company your father and I built, I corrected. The distinction matters. What if I refuse? Julian asked. What if I fight this publicly? Consequences be damned. Then the company suffers. You face criminal prosecution, and you still lose, I said. But you also destroy your father's legacy entirely. Harrison built something real, something valuable. You can preserve that legacy by acknowledging the truth, or you can demolish it by fighting a battle you can't win. Silence stretched between us. I watched Julian wrestle with the choice, seeing the calculation play across his features. Pride versus pragmatism. Image versus reality. Finally, he looked at his attorneys. What are the actual criminal exposure risks? His lead attorney didn't sugarcoat it. Substantial. Document fraud, commercial registry violations, potential shareholder lawsuits. Best case is significant fines and probation. Worst case is prison time. And either way, your reputation and career are finished. Julian closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked directly at me. My father trusted you. He did, I agreed. And I honored that trust by building something extraordinary with him. You dishonored it by trying to erase me from that history. He never told me, Julian said quietly, about the original agreements, about your equity stake. He just said you were trusted family, an advisor. I thought I was preserving what was mine. By forging documents, Francoise asked skeptically. By correcting what I thought was an oversight, Julian said. My father died suddenly. There were so many things left unclear. And you, he looked at me, you never pushed back. You just kept working, kept advising, never mentioned ownership or equity. I thought you'd been bought out, or had sold your stake, or it was always informal. I thought I was just formalizing reality. It was, I realized, probably true. Harrison had been so insistent on keeping my role quiet that even his own son hadn't understood the truth. And after Harrison's death, Julian had found ambiguous arrangements and corrected them to match his understanding. Which didn't excuse the forgeries, didn't excuse the systematic erasure, didn't excuse the character assassination article, but it did explain how someone could rationalize such actions. Your father kept things quiet because he believed it served the company, I said. But secrets have a way of creating problems. He should have been transparent with you. I should have insisted on it. But none of that changes what happened. You didn't just formalize reality, you manufactured a false one. Julian nodded slowly. I accept your terms. His attorney looked shocked. Julian, we should discuss. I accept the terms, Julian repeated. Full equity restoration, public acknowledgement, my resignation from CEO, in exchange for no criminal prosecution and characterizing this as administrative errors rather than deliberate fraud. He stood, extending his hand across the table. I'm sorry. For what I did. For what I said about you. You deserved better. I studied his hand for a moment. This wasn't forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that. But it was closure, an acknowledgement, a path forward. I shook his hand. Thank you. The attorneys drew up the settlement agreement that afternoon. By evening, it was signed, notarized, and filed. By the next morning, a press release went out. Kensington and Vale, clarifies founding history, announces leadership transition. The statement was carefully worded, acknowledging administrative discrepancies in historical documentation and announcing that co-founder status has been fully restored to Harrison Kensington's sibling, along with appropriate equity recognition. It praised Julian's service, but noted his decision to step aside from executive responsibilities to allow fresh leadership. The business press covered it as a corporate governance story, unusual but not scandalous. Most coverage focused on the upcoming merger discussions with Rothschild, which were confirmed in the same announcement. What the press didn't know, and what we'd agreed never to publicize, the full extent of the forgeries, the character assassination article's origins, the depth of the betrayal. Some truths were better left private, not to protect Julian, but to protect the company and its people. 3 days later, at the official board meeting to formalize everything, Richard Wexler made an unexpected proposal. Given the transition period we're entering, and given the proven strategic expertise we've rediscovered, I move that we appoint our co-founder as interim CEO, pending permanent recruitment. I started to object. I'd never wanted the CEO role, never sought the spotlight, but Laurent Rothschild spoke first. I second that motion, and I'll note that from Rothschild's perspective, having someone with this individual's demonstrated integrity and strategic vision in the CEO role would significantly accelerate our merger discussions. The vote was unanimous. At 58 years old, after 32 years of being told to stay in the shadows, I became CEO of the company I'd helped build. Not because I'd demanded it, not because I'd fought for the title, but because finally, people could see what I'd always been. 6 months later, I stood in the same boardroom where this had all begun, looking out at the Zurich cityscape I'd helped build a place in. The Rothschild merger had closed 2 weeks ago. Kensington and Vale was now part of a transatlantic luxury collective worth $18 billion, with properties in 34 countries and artisan partnerships spanning 5 continents. Laurent Rothschild served as chairman, I served as CEO, and together we'd built something that honored heritage while embracing innovation. The merger terms had been generous, significantly more favorable than what Julian had originally negotiated, because Laurent trusted the person at the helm. Trust, it turned out, was worth billions in deal terms. Julian had transitioned quietly. He'd kept his board seat, as agreed, but rarely attended meetings. I'd heard he was traveling, spending time with his family, considering what he actually wanted to do, rather than what he'd inherited the obligation to do. A few weeks ago, I'd received a handwritten letter from him. Not an apology, we'd moved beyond those, but a reflection. He wrote about Harrison, about the pressure of living up to a legacy he'd never fully understood, about the fear that had driven him to erase me, rather than admit he needed help. My father once told me, he wrote, that the hardest part of leadership is admitting what you don't know. I never learned that lesson, but watching you navigate this merger, seeing how you balance preservation with growth, I'm finally understanding what he meant. What you both built wasn't just a company. It was an approach to business built on relationships and integrity. I inherited the company, but missed the approach. That was my real failure. The letter sat in my desk drawer now, a reminder that hurt often comes from fear, and fear comes from inadequacy. Julian had felt inadequate to his father's legacy, so he'd tried to simplify it by erasing complexity. which meant erasing me. I understood that now. Didn't excuse it, but understood it. Paolo Vincenzo and the other artisan partners had been integrated into the expanded company with new protections and enhanced resources. Their heritage standards were now written into the merger agreement itself, protected by both Rothschild's reputation and my direct oversight. The Italian textile house had actually expanded production, hiring local craftspeople and reviving traditional techniques that had been at risk of disappearing. Paolo sent me photos every week, young apprentices learning from master weavers, old looms restored to working condition, fabric that honored centuries of tradition while meeting modern luxury standards. "This is what you promised," he'd said during his last visit to Zurich. "Not just preservation, but continuation, evolution. You kept that promise." Claire, Julian's former assistant, now served as my chief of staff. She'd been instrumental in the transition, knowing where all the bodies were buried, figuratively, and how to navigate the company's politics. When I'd offered her the position, she'd cried. "I've watched Julian for 3 years," she'd said. "I watched him prioritize image over substance, control over trust, ego over expertise. Working for someone who actually knows how to build something, it's like breathing clean air after years in smog." The company had stabilized remarkably quickly. Turns out, when you operate with integrity, treat partners fairly, and honor commitments, business relationships strengthen rather than fracture. We'd announced several new acquisitions. Since the merger, a Scottish cashmere producer, an Austrian crystal manufacturer, a Provençal lavender estate. Each one negotiated with the same approach I'd used 30 years ago, understanding their story, protecting their heritage, creating partnership rather than extraction, and each one working because I'd spent 3 decades learning how to do it right. I was leaving the office, earlier than usual, actually keeping reasonable hours now, when my phone rang, a number I hadn't seen in months. "Hello," I answered. "It's Julian." A pause. "I wanted you to know. I'm getting married, next spring. Small ceremony. Just family." "Congratulations," I said, meaning it. "I'd like you to be there," he said. "If that's not too awkward. You're family. You were always family, even when I forgot that." I thought about it. About forgiveness and forward movement. About the difference between forgetting harm and choosing not to let it define you. "I'll be there," I said. After we hung up, I stood in the empty lobby, looking at the company logo etched in the marble floor. Kensington and Vale, Estate 1993. The date was finally accurate again. I thought about Harrison, about what he might say if he could see this. Would he be disappointed in his son's actions? Certainly, but he'd also be proud of the resolution, of the company not just surviving, but thriving, of relationships honored and heritage protected. And maybe he'd be proud of me too, for finally standing up, for refusing to stay erased, for proving that at 58 I was just getting started. My phone buzzed, a text from Françoise. "Drink to celebrate, or are you too important now?" Followed by a winking emoji, her first attempt at casual texting, which made me smile. I texted back, celebrating the fact that I actually left the office before 8. "Tomorrow, though. Tonight I need sleep." "Getting old," she replied. "Getting smart," I wrote back. I walked out into the Zurich evening, the city lights reflecting off buildings my work had helped purchase. Headquarters I'd helped design, an empire I'd helped build. 58 years old, 32 years of work, 8 years of erasure, 6 months of recovery, and finally, at last, publicly acknowledged as exactly what I'd always been: a founder, a strategist, a builder. Not because I'd demanded recognition, not because I'd fought for a title, but because I'd refused to let someone else's narrative erase my reality. That was the real victory. Not the equity, not the CEO role, not even the merger. The victory was proving that your worth doesn't depend on whether others acknowledge it. Your contributions don't disappear because someone tries to erase them. Your truth doesn't become fiction just because someone tells a different story. You are what you built, what you created, what you gave, regardless of whether anyone says your name. But it's also nice, after 32 years, when they finally do. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see in those early days. Being underestimated was never my weakness. It was my advantage. While Julian focused on appearance, I focused on substance. While he worried about credit, I built relationships. While he tried to erase history, I created a future. Age isn't decline, it's accumulation of knowledge, experience, relationships, wisdom. At 58, I didn't have less to offer. I had more. 32 years more than the 26-year-old who'd started the journey. To everyone who's been told they're past their prime, that their contributions don't matter, that they should step aside for the next generation, your experience is power. Your relationships are currency. Your knowledge is irreplaceable. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more stories from Mr. Douglas Tales, where every fall becomes a rise.